Cabo Pulmo sits on the eastern cape of the Baja Peninsula, where the Gulf of California narrows towards some of the warmest, most nutrient dense water in the eastern Pacific. The reef there, 20,000 years old, the only living hard coral formation on the entire west coast of North America, was once part of what Jacques Cousteau called the aquarium of the world. By the early 1990s, the aquarium was empty. Decades of unregulated fishing had stripped the reef of its sharks, its groupers, its jacks, its snapper. Boat anchors had crushed the ancient coral heads. Algae had smothered what the anchors missed. Surveys showed the reef held no more life than completely unprotected, open access water where anybody could take anything, any day of the year. The village beside it, fewer than 200 people, a handful of families, one dirt road to the outside world, was collapsing alongside it. Fishermen burned more fuel each season to reach further into open water, hauling nets that came back lighter every trip. Some came back empty. Those families made a decision that looked, from the outside, like they were speeding up their own collapse. They stopped fishing, all of it. No nets, no hooks, no harvest of any kind. They built nothing. They planted nothing. They introduced nothing into the water. They removed themselves from the equation and then stood guard to make sure nobody else filled the gap. 15 years later, scientists measured the result, a 463% increase in total fish biomass. Apex predators at 11 times their former numbers, the largest absolute recovery of marine life ever recorded in any protected area on Earth. From a village you could drive through in under a minute without knowing it was there. The question is why this place recovered when every other protected reef in the Gulf of California kept declining. The destruction of Cabo Pulmo followed a sequence so predictable it almost runs itself. Start at the top of the food chain and work your way down. Local families, the Castros, the Cañedos, had fished the reef for generations, modestly enough that the system held. When a disease wiped out the region's pearl oyster beds in the 1940s, the whole economy shifted to open water fish. By the 70s, outboard motors, fiberglass hulls, and synthetic gill nets turned that shift into mechanized extraction. Sport fishing fleets arrived from the north chasing marlin and sharks. 20,000 commercial fishermen entered the broader Gulf during that decade. The apex predators went first: bull sharks, tiger sharks, marlin, taken for sport, and the international shark fin trade. Once those populations collapsed, the pressure shifted downward to Gulf grouper, snapper, slow-growing species that need years to reach reproductive size. When those thinned out, the boats started hauling smaller and smaller fish until there was almost nothing left to haul. And that was just the biological extraction. The physical damage ran parallel. Anchors dragged across shallow coral heads, crushing structures that had taken centuries to build. The removal of herbivorous fish, parrotfish, surgeonfish, eliminated the grazers that kept algae in check. Without them, algae smothered every surface, sealing off the rock from new coral larvae. The reef locked into a degraded state it couldn't escape on its own. None of this was unique to Cabo Pulmo. Reefs across the Gulf were failing under identical pressure, and the Mexican government had tried to respond. They established marine protected areas, they issued fishing permits, they designated no-take zones on nautical charts. It made no difference. 7 out of 10 regional marine parks protected less than 6% of their total area as actual no-take territory. The designated zones at Laredo Bay National Park covered a combined 1.4 square kilometers, a sliver of the daily range of any grouper or shark they were meant to shelter. Between 1999 and 2009, species richness inside those zones actually dropped. The parks existed in federal law. On the water, they were invisible, written by officials who never boarded a fishing boat, enforced by agencies with no budget to patrol, ignored by communities that had no alternative income and no economic reason to follow the rules. The reef at Cabo Pulmo didn't need anything added to it. It needed the pressure to physically stop, and no governance model anywhere in the Gulf of California had ever made that happen. The answer came from the people who had caused the damage. In the late 80s, marine biologists from the Autonomous University of Baja California Sur began visiting Cabo Pulmo to study the reef's decline. The most consequential thing they did had nothing to do with data collection. They brought diving masks. For decades, these families had fished from the surface, dropping lines, dragging nets, without ever seeing the reef below them. When they put their faces in the water, the destruction was immediate and physical: bare rock, crushed coral, empty sand. The place their fathers described as dense with life was gone. The Castro family led the response. Across 2 generations, Jesus, Mario, Juan, Judith, David, they built consensus in the village that fishing at Cabo Pulmo was over. Not reduced, not regulated. Over. They petitioned the federal government for a national park, working with the university biologists to assemble the scientific case. On June 6, 1995, President Ernesto Zedillo signed the decree: Cabo Pulmo National Park. 71 square kilometers of ocean, slightly larger than the island of Manhattan. The official language designated 35% as a core no-take zone, with the rest open to regulated use. The community treated virtually the entire park as no-take, every square kilometer of it. Former fishermen converted their pangas, the same small fiberglass skiffs they had fished from, into patrol boats and ran daily loops along the park's boundaries. When boats from neighboring villages crossed in to poach, local captains intercepted them and pushed them out. There was no navy, no federal police presence, just 5 extended families who had staked their economic future on a living reef and were not going to let anyone else kill it while they waited. That is the variable, not the park's acreage, not the coral species, not the latitude or the water temperature. 5 families with total consensus, direct financial stakes in the outcome, and daily physical presence on the water versus paper designations managed from 1,000 kilometers away by agencies that had never set foot on a panga. The reef biology was the same across every collapsing site in the Gulf. The governance was not, and for 4 years the bet returned nothing. In 1999, a team led by marine biologist Octavio Aburto-Oropeza surveyed 60 reefs across the Gulf of California. The number that came back from Cabo Pulmo was 0.75 tons of fish per hectare, identical to 1995, identical to completely unprotected waters where commercial boats fished without any restriction whatsoever. 4 years of zero fishing income, 4 years of learning to scuba dive and trying to attract tourists who had mostly never heard of the place. 4 years of sharing food across households, stretching government vouchers, burning through whatever savings existed. And the data confirmed what the empty reef suggested. The families had sacrificed their livelihoods, and the water had given back nothing measurable. They stayed. They had no guarantee the biology would respond, no model to tell them when. They had a 20,000-year-old reef, a hypothesis that it would rebuild if left alone, and a community dense enough, 5 families intermarried across generations on the same coastline, to distribute the financial damage rather than let it break anyone apart. The reason nothing showed up in the surveys is reproductive math. Fish produce eggs in proportion to body mass, and the relationship is exponential, not linear. A large female grouper produces orders of magnitude more eggs than a small one. With the population hammered to almost nothing, the surviving fish needed years to reach the sizes where their combined reproductive output could outpace natural mortality and begin to compound. The reef wasn't failing to respond. Every year of that flatline was another generation of juveniles growing toward the threshold. The 4 years of silence were the cost of a biological clock that no policy could speed up, and community self-enforcement was the only governance structure in the Gulf that had ever absorbed that cost without breaking. Around 2005, the threshold broke, and it did not break quietly. The first visible sign was the schools, massive columns of big-eye jacks, the spiraling formations visible in so much of. The footage from this reef, thousands of fish rotating in tight formation, appeared for the first time in living memory. Local dive guides, most of them former fishermen, saw them before any scientist did. The chain that produced those schools can be traced link by link, each step enabling the next. Herbivores moved first. Parrotfish and surgeonfish, fast breeders, relatively quick to mature, were the earliest populations to rebound. Their grazing stripped algae off the coral surfaces, exposing clean rock where new coral larvae could settle and grow. Without anchors smashing the structure and without algae choking the surfaces, the reef's 3-dimensional architecture began to rebuild. Crevices, overhangs, tunnels, the kind of geometry that juvenile fish need to survive their first months. That structural complexity pulled in the next tier: snappers, wrasses, mid-sized jacks, species that occupy the middle of the food web, populated the recovering reef in dense, permanent schools. Their biomass created the prey base necessary to sustain what came after. The apex predators returned. Bull sharks, tiger sharks, giant Gulf groupers, the same species fished to functional extinction 3 decades earlier, reappeared not as visitors but as residents. Acoustic tracking between 2015 and 2019 confirmed year-round bull shark populations inside the park, with males and females using different parts of the reef at different times of year, a pattern consistent with a fully established breeding population. In 2009, Aburto-Oropeza's team came back with 435 underwater surveys spanning the Gulf. The numbers from Cabo Pulmo were unlike anything in the published literature. Total fish biomass had reached 4.24 tons per hectare, a 463% increase from the 1999 baseline. Top predator biomass had climbed 11-fold. Species richness went from 15 to 25 per survey count, while the identical metric in unprotected Gulf waters had declined during the same decade. The reef had rebuilt an inverted biomass pyramid, the structural signature of a pristine, unfished ocean. A massive canopy of slow-growing predators sustained by a fast-reproducing base of smaller prey. A structure that hadn't existed at Cabo Pulmo in anyone's lifetime. But the chain extended past the park's invisible borders. Between 2015 and 2017, acoustic monitoring documented a major spawning aggregation of the endangered Gulf grouper inside the park, the first recorded there in the modern scientific era. Males were producing synchronized courtship calls, a fully restored reproductive behavior that overfishing had silenced for decades. DNA analysis of plankton samples identified over 20,000 fish eggs and more than 1,000 larvae spanning 112 species, including migratory game fish that no traditional diver survey had ever detected. The park had become a pump. Eggs and larvae carried by coastal currents flow outward into the Gulf. An estimated 5,300 tons of living biomass now spills over the park's boundaries every year, restocking commercial fishing grounds the community of Cabo Pulmo will never harvest. The reef that 5 families stopped fishing is feeding fisheries across the wider Gulf of California. That transformation from closed sanctuary to regional biological engine was nearly destroyed before anyone fully understood its scale. In 2008, a Spanish developer proposed Cabo Cortés, a $2 billion mega resort directly adjacent to the park. 30,000 hotel rooms, 2 golf courses, a marina, a desalination plant that would have discharged concentrated brine directly into the currents feeding the reef. The same families who had given up fishing and patrolled their waters for 13 years now had to fight a multinational development corporation. They organized international campaigns, allied with scientists and conservation groups, and gathered 220,000 petition signatures. The legal battle lasted 4 years. In June 2012, the Mexican president publicly canceled the project's permits. The threat resurfaced in 2014 under a different corporate name, and again in 2024, and again in early 2025, when another resort development less than 2 kilometers from the park boundary had its permit suspended after lawyers proved the developers had concealed the project's coastal impact. The families who gave up fishing to save a reef had become permanently its last line of political defense. The lead researcher, Octavio Aburto-Oropeza, put it in one sentence: no other marine reserve in the world has shown such a fish recovery. One behavioral change by fewer than 200 people. 0 technology, 0 construction, 0 imported organisms. The park now supports over 800 documented species, including 5 of the world's 7 endangered sea turtle species. Annual ecotourism revenue, family-run dive shops, small guest houses, guided snorkeling runs to roughly $8 million across a community that 30 years ago was hauling in empty nets and running out of options. The data from Cabo Pulmo has become one of the most cited real-world cases behind the United Nations target to strictly protect 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. From fewer than 200 people on a dirt road sharing food to survive a decade where the ocean showed no sign of responding, with nothing more sophisticated than a diving mask in a fiberglass skiff. But the data is not the mechanism. The reef healed because reefs heal. That capacity was always there, latent in the 20,000-year-old coral, waiting. Every other marine park in the Gulf of California had the same biological potential. They didn't recover because the pressure never actually stopped. The permits were issued, the zones were drawn, and every morning the boats went out. What Cabo Pulmo proved is that the only governance architecture that has ever produced a full marine recovery in this region was not designed by a federal agency or funded by an international body. It was built by fishermen, five families who policed their own 71 square kilometers because their livelihood depended on what was underneath it. That alignment, proximity, incentive, consensus, daily presence is the mechanism. Everything else was the ocean doing what the ocean does when you let it. Cabo Pulmo is not a reef story. It is proof that the barrier was never biological. The biology was always capable of recovery. The only missing variable was a human structure that could hold the pressure off long enough for the biology to respond and absorb the cost of silence while it waited. If that kind of engineering interests you, how systems break, how they get fixed, and who does the fixing, subscribe. We cover one project at a time every time.